Ladies and gentlemen, Assalamu alaikum. Thank you so much for waiting. My name is Mudassir Ahmed, and I'm the president of the Concordia Forum, based here in London, where we have just opened our fast literally a couple of minutes ago. It is my great pleasure to be hosting, or have organized this 11th session of Distant Socializing, and we're delighted to have some very esteemed guests with us today. Hosting this session will be Wajahat Ali, who is a New York Times contributor, longtime Concordia member, somebody who I think first came almost 8 years ago, and of course a distinguished playwright, and somebody who is very widely respected for his work across not just our community, but many communities. And of course, he will be in conversation with our star attraction this evening, who I believe should be online. Pete Buttigieg, mayor of South Bend, but of course we all know him for his incredibly inspirational campaign to be the presidential nominee for the Democratic Party. So I'm now going to hand over to Wajahat, who will take it from here. Wajahat, over to you.
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone tuning in from around the world during quarantine. I hope everyone is doing as well as they can during these interesting times. It's good to know that I'm widely respected. I think that's the first time I've ever heard that, so thank you, Mudassir. And it's a pleasure to be joined by Mayor Pete. And for those of you who are tuning in, let it be known that Mayor Pete has not converted to Islam yet. So just the day is young, though. The day is young. And for those of you who are taking bets, my wife and I essentially have made a bet that Mayor Pete has acquired at least 4 new languages during quarantine. So how many new languages have you picked up during this lockdown?
Well, nice to see you, and thanks for having me in. I've mostly just been trying to restore what remains of my English. A presidential campaign can kind of leave you pretty brain-addled because you spend a year with a tremendous range of places you go and a tiny range of things that you talk about in a way. So you gradually have my wits coming back.
Yeah, so you basically became a slacker during quarantine. It's okay. We won't judge you. It's all right. It's all right. It's fine. And also, let it be known, I'm impressed by the fact that you have no quarantine facial hair. You probably are the most well-kept man that I've seen during the quarantine. So well done, Mayor Pete.
There was a flirtation with a quarantine beard. It lasted about 2 or 3 weeks, and then public opinion here in the household turned against it, and that was the end of the beard.
Brother, I feel you, because my wife said if I cut my facial hair, bad things will happen. So we're in the same boat. You know, we have, for those of you who are tuning in, we have 15 minutes of conversation with Mayor Pete. Then we have about 15, 20 minutes with 10 American Muslims who will give their thoughts about the future of the Democratic Party. And then we will reconvene for a conversation and a Q&A. And you mentioned the campaign, and I was thinking about whether or not to go here, because I don't want you to be feel like you're a masochist here in this conversation. But I want to take this DeLorean back to March 1st, a pivotal day. You were running to be the Democratic presidential candidate. You got Iowa. You were really close in New Hampshire. You had picked up 26 delegates. I mean, you were in it. And then national headlines: Pete Buttigieg decides to drop out. If you can, take us to that moment when you woke up and you knew, like, I got to take my hat out of this ring.
So it's obviously a tough call to make, especially when you have put everything you've got and more than you knew you had into this one single purpose. But, you know, I also had to look at the numbers, and I had a very honest and truth-telling team that were kind of looking at the numbers with me. And what we saw, you know, it's thrilling to come in, especially when you're you started out as an obscure mayor from the middle of America, to come in the top 3 in the first 3 states voting for the presidency. But when you do it in that order, in other words, we won Iowa, we're 2nd in New Hampshire, 3rd in Nevada, and then Joe Biden had a commanding success in South Carolina, largely based on the level of trust that he had earned over decades with Black voters in the state. It was clear to me that the path had narrowed beyond being realistic for us. The other thing that was clear to me was that, you know, in the same way that I sought to have an impact by, of course, getting in the race and hopefully becoming the nominee and being elected president, the decision about whether and how and when to get out of the race was also a decision that could have an impact, that could have a consequence. And I knew after looking at the numbers from South Carolina, looking at Super Tuesday coming up, where there were some states we felt we would beat expectations, but it was still going to be a long road, that maybe I was having, it would be selfish to remain in just to do it, because that might have an effect too. And I thought, part of what I thought I was doing as a candidate was being somebody who could start bringing together the party. And I realized that the best thing I could do to start bringing together the party was to stop being a candidate. And so as soon as I woke up with that awareness, I knew that it was time to begin wrapping up the campaign in the course of a pretty dramatic 24 hours that began. I began with breakfast with President and Mrs. Carter. The schedule had me in Plains, Georgia, spending time with them. And then that afternoon, the haunting experience of visiting the Edmund Pettus Bridge in Selma for the commemoration of the courage of the civil rights marchers there, seeing John Lewis step out and address the crowd. At that point, I had tears streaming down my face thinking about what all of us were part of. And then at the end of that day, returned to South Bend and shared with my supporters that it was time to step out.
And the drama continued, because that was March 1st, for those of you who are listening, and that was only 2.5 months ago. And during quarantine, that feels like it was 30 years ago. And March 1st, you had that eventful day, like you just described, where many people thanked you for that decision, because the number one priority for most Democratic voters polled is to get Trump out and get a Democrat in the White House. March 2nd, you make another decision. Right before Super Tuesday, you say, I'm officially endorsing Joe Biden. And this reveals both the pleasure of many Democrats, but also a fissure, because they say, Pete, it's between Biden and Bernie, and you have considerable weight, and now you're leaning in with Joe Biden. So before we continue about that decision, what was it about Joe Biden's platform and leadership that made you decide to put your equity, your name, and your influence behind him and his campaign right before Super Tuesday?
I'll tell you the biggest thing. Throughout my campaign, one of our main themes was the idea of belonging. At a time when we have a crisis of belonging, and in my view, a crisis in the way that people treat each other, both across partisan and ideological lines, and sometimes within the ranks of those who I consider to be largely aligned on the big things. In a different way, with a different vocabulary, I think the same sentiment has really animated Joe Biden's campaign. On the very day he got into the race, he expressed his campaign's rationale in terms of the soul of America. And it rhymed so much with what I thought was at stake in the election. And I think this is something certainly that you feel as a mayor, that the job of the presidency, of course, it's about policy, and it's making sure you have the right policies. But one of the reasons it's different from being a legislator is it's not only about policy. It's about management and administration, building a government, competently running one. We're seeing now why it's so terrible and we don't have that. But even over and above that, it's something else. And it's something about the ability to draw people together and call people to their highest values that I believe that I saw in the compassionate approach that Joe Biden brings to politics. Not that we agreed on everything, no two people do, but that in addition to broadly agreeing on where our country needed to go, there was a sense of what I think he wants to do, not just as a policymaker, not just as an executive, but as a leader that rhymed with the values and vision of my campaign. And I think now we're in a moment where there were 24 different candidates with 24 different sets of followers.
I remember.
And look, a lot of healthy differences among us. That, by the way, we'll go right back to litigating and negotiating in the governing process, right? About how to make sure that we're a zero carbon society by the middle of the century, how to make sure that everybody has healthcare and that it's established as a human right, how to empower workers and raise wages. But the question that's at stake in November is not how to do those things, it's whether to do those things. We are literally now in a contest between somebody who thinks we should deal with climate change and somebody who thinks it's a hoax. And the question now is to settle that. And then I have every confidence that in our lovely, messy, democratic, fractious way, we will go right back to negotiating the details of how we can get that done.
And this is just a safe space. It's only you and me right now. Don't worry, no one's paying attention. What position did he offer you?
No, there was no talk of that. And, he said the same thing publicly that he said privately, which is that he does view himself as somebody who's going to play a role in guiding the future generation of leadership and Americans forward. Regardless of whether this leads to a return to public service for me, I'm all in just as an American citizen to make sure that he wins.
Suppose Joe Biden comes up to you, he wins, and he says, Pete, I respect you. You remind me of my son, Bo. I really appreciate you coming down and helping me at a time when I really needed it. This campaign needed it. What do you want?
I think indulging in that kind of fantasy is just putting the cart.
Indulge. It's Ramadan. Indulge.
I mean, look, what I want to do is make myself useful. And I saw a way to do it by running for president. I now see a way to do it by doing everything in my power to support Joe Biden and help him get elected. And then I'll find, whether it's inside or outside of government, come November, I'll find new ways to make myself useful.
Classy answer, sir. Classy answer. You described the soul of the nation, and we have to preserve the soul of the nation, right? Many Democrats, especially the youth, many who consider themselves part of the progressive wing, feel like they are also fighting for the soul of the nation. And a candidate like Bernie or Warren, for them, it's literally for their survival. There's an April New York Times article that talked to many Bernie supporters. Most of them said that are very unenthusiastic about Biden. They'll hold their nose and vote for him. In the poll that they said in that April article, 80% said, all right, we'll vote for Biden. 15% said they wouldn't. How does Biden and the DNC reach out to these progressive Democrats who feel that this party does not recognize them, represent them, or really value their concerns? Because you need every vote to beat Trump, especially, I don't know if you've seen his tweets. He's apparently going against Michigan right now for absentee ballots. So apparently So, I mean, he's going to cheat. So you need every vote possible. How do you guys reach out to the substantial part? It's not just the fringe. It's not just the lefties. It's a lot of people who feel left out. Yeah.
Well, first of all, it's to say, I get it, right? I mean, I'm not as young as many of the folks you're talking about, but I'm young enough that I will, God willing, spend decades on the business end of the decisions that are about to be made and the success or the failure of what's about to happen. So I feel that urgency too. And I feel the frustration with the system that has let us down in a lot of ways. The biggest message I want for young people to feel is empowerment. And the empowerment is through your vote. And again, electing the president is the beginning of then a governing process where we will negotiate. If you think that the approach that he, or for that matter, I was advocating on how to hit the goal of being a carbon neutral society by the middle of the century, if you think that doesn't go far enough or isn't done in the right way, fine, we will definitely have that out in the richness of the democratic tradition, if and only if we actually have government that believes it's real. So the questions of how, I don't mean to minimize them, they're the questions that we litigated the whole primary over, but the questions of how need to take a back seat to the question of whether, because we are now going to settle the question as a country of whether there will even be an attempt to deliver economic justice, racial equality, climate action. And that was before we got to the pandemic situation, where the question of how we get out of this is nothing short of the question of what our social and political and economic arrangements are going to look like for the rest of our lives. And that's what's at stake in a process that you can't just set out because the leaders are imperfect. Of course we are. Everybody's imperfect. But let's remember that this November election, should we win, is the beginning and not the end of the process of those reforms that I think with a lot of justified impatience, many younger and more progressive activists want to see happen immediately.
And you mentioned the question of whether versus how we do it. I think healthcare is a great example, because what we know from Donald Trump's own words is that he wants to get rid of Obamacare. He wants to get rid of Obamacare during a pandemic, which means millions of our fellow Americans, and I know there's people around the world who are paying attention to this right now, and they're like, it's insane that your country, the most powerful country in the world, does not have this affordable healthcare system. But he wants to get rid of Obamacare. Many people, especially as I know the youth, Bernie supporters, progressives, want Medicare for all. I know you weren't for Medicare for all, but we're in a pandemic right now. And it seems that the progressive policies that were promoted by many Democrats are what's going to save the nation. If we come out of this pandemic, and hopefully we will, say it's September, October, and they poll again on Medicare for all. Suppose more than 50% of Americans are down with Medicare for all. Would you change your position on M for A?
So I still believe that commanding Americans to take a public plan when they don't want to is not the right thing to do. I also believe that Medicare for All is likely to be the long-term destination, probably the right answer. I just believe that as a matter of humility baked into the policy, we should give people some choice. So defaulting people into the public plan totally makes sense. And another thing, of course, that the pandemic is revealing that was discussed during the campaign, but I think is understood to be even more important now, is the decoupling, the fundamental illogic of having so many of our benefits tied to our employment when our employment is becoming less and less stable. So yes, I think that the case for public health care and public health insurance was strong before. I think it's only grown stronger. Personally, I still think that doesn't require prohibiting the existence of private insurance. I guess you could say I believe in a private option. And I don't think that would change if poll numbers change. But again, this is a question of policy design. The most important thing is that we agree that everybody ought to have healthcare, and that there ought to be an expanded, well, when I say we, I mean, what you might call the center left to the left, and that there ought to be an expanded public role in making it happen.
I want to ask one more question before we open up to American Muslim leaders. There's a pandemic. Mayor Cuomo, March 30th, I believe, said the pandemic has flattened all of us. However, I think a more accurate description would be it has flattened all of us, but not flattened all of us equally. For those of you who are paying attention, we're looking at the United States of America. It's a painful time right now. We have over 90,000 dead. We have over 1.5 million infected. We don't have the test. We don't have the contact tracing. It's painful when my family from Pakistan is taking pity on America right now. But it's also affecting specifically African-American communities, Latino communities, those who are poor, those who are immunocompromised, and seniors. And this is not to relitigate, but you got a lot of heat in your campaign from communities of color. Specifically Black communities, and you had a tough time winning them over. You've had, hindsight's 2020. What have you learned about how you and Democrats could do better, should do better, in reaching out to the base of the Democratic Party, that is African-American voters who currently are suffering the most, more than any other community when it comes to this pandemic?
Well, I think the most important thing is for those who have been marginalized, and especially Black voters who have, as you say, have been the core of the party, especially where we've been electorally successful, see themselves reflected in the shaping of every part of a campaign and every part of the party. And I think over time, we grew into that as a campaign, but not quickly enough. And again, it proved to be no match for the level of trust that Joe Biden had developed. I think not as a result of, I don't think any of us could have said there was a level of policy perfection, but rather as a result of knowledge and encounter with Black communities. What I think we got right was the substance of our policies, things like the Douglas Plan, Frederick Douglass Plan for empowering Black Americans on everything from economic empowerment and capital formation to criminal justice reform. But what I think is equally important is to make sure that there's a level of listening and humbling that goes on that is so important for voters who have felt taken for granted, who have been taken for granted in so many ways. And a lot depends on whether Black communities in particular, who are, as you say, experiencing the worst of this pandemic, not because the virus discriminates, right? There's no evidence that the virus affects anybody differently simply because they're Black. Rather, the virus reveals all the way that society is discriminating because the lack of access to healthcare, or living in a food desert and living with some of the conditions that make the virus, if you contract it, more lethal, whether diabetes or hypertension, or just not having had health insurance at some point in your life. Poverty, the overlay of questions of environmental justice, as you have Black families and other families of color that have been redlined into the areas that are most likely to have pollution or air quality issues. On top of the fact that we now also know that Black and brown workers are more likely to be exposed. So not only is it more dangerous for you if you get it, it is also more likely that you will get it because the very same workers who have been treated and compensated as though their jobs were disposable are now also being informed that their jobs are essential and they have to go into work, and are less likely to have the opportunity or the advantage, the privilege really, of being able to work from home. So showing a responsiveness to that goes a lot more than I think just showing up with good intentions. And I think that, you know, the humbling experiences that we had in our campaign were of finding ways, and it was really only in the latest days of the campaign that I think we found our voice in a way I wish we had a year earlier, to ensure that there's no presumption of understanding, but there is some readiness to form a level of shared goodwill there.
And because you opened it up, if you don't mind, and you talked about the humbling of the campaign, and I appreciate your candor, how did it humble you personally as a candidate who said, I'm going to be the commander-in-chief of this country of over 330 million? You had to, like I said, you had to endure the criticism, you got the pushback, you got a lot of scathing critiques, especially from Black critics and communities of color. You got a lot of support as well. But if you don't mind, before I open it up, how did it humble you as a white man with an education who was running for president, a young man who got the delegates? How did it humble you to realize that, you know, a lot of communities of color are saying Mayor Pete's not our guy?
Well, I think the most humbling thing is to understand that just because you have a level of maybe intellectual familiarity with the experience of our racialized society doesn't mean that you've really taken it on board. And you have to find ways, knowing that you'll never fully understand what it is to walk in the shoes of somebody with that experience. You have to find ways to take it on board and to put their voice, not yours, at the center of that conversation. And so, you know, the things that went best for us were when we had often it was Black and brown voices telling their own truth about their encounter with the campaign. It was different than the way I would put things, but was truer in so many ways. And understanding also that there is no substitute for time, right? So again, seeing the way that, you know, even candidates of color were not able to get the kind of trust in the electorate that Joe Biden had, I think is humbling for anybody who tries to do things in a hurry, the way that certainly is one way you could look at my own trajectory.
I appreciate the answer, Mayor Pete. We're going to do a pause for a second, and I'm going to introduce 10 American Muslim leaders from across the nation. They're going to give their thoughts in 90 seconds or less, yes, in 90 seconds or less, somehow magically, about the future of the Democratic Party. I appreciate, Mayor Pete, that you're sticking around and actually listening to them, and then we're going to continue this conversation on the back end. First up, all the way from Southern California, we have Mohannad Malas. Mohannad Malas is a real estate titan. His IRA capital owns some of the most valuable commercial properties in Southern California. He sits on several nonprofit boards and has been cited as, quote, the Steve Jobs of social entrepreneurship for his nonprofit work. Mohannad, take it away.
Wow. Thank you, Mayor Pete. It's a pleasure to talk to you. And I think just simplistically saying it's about the economy, stupid. So I'm just wondering, is this election going to be won by the personality and the greatness of Biden, or is it going to be Trump losing for opening the economy too soon and putting us back in this potential comeback of the virus? And with 40 million Americans unemployed at this time, even the most people, you know, that think they want to think brightly, they say we can probably employ 2 to 4 million people by the coming 12 months. That will still leave us about 36 to 38 million unemployed Americans. So I'm just wondering how can this economy come back? How can the Democrats do well? I've been very impressed by your programs that you've done, where you've actually brought private-public cooperation, where you did your vacant and abandoned properties project, where you did your home repair initiative, where you worked with the St. Joseph County and created the double track in South Bend. So these are, do you find that opportunity with the Democratic Party is going to be able to create these public-private relationships?
Mayor Pete, just hold off on responding. We're going to listen to all 10, and then I'm going to get you on the back end. Next up, we have Shahzad Bhatti, CEO of Axiom Learning, one of the fastest growing edtech companies, and hailed by Bill Gates. Bhatti was also a delegate to the Democratic Party convention. He graduated top of his class from Harvard Law School, where he also taught. He's coming to us from Seattle, Washington, and I have to say that he told my wife to marry me, so he has good taste. Shahzad.
Thanks, Waj. I appreciate it. Mayor Pete, thanks so much for taking the time. I think to me, the lesson of Mayor Pete, the inspiring lesson of Mayor Pete is that the past of the Democratic Party is not the future of the Democratic Party, right? So whether it be Kennedy being the first major Catholic, Obama being the first African-American, Hillary being the first kind of woman nominee of a major party, and now Mayor Pete proving that an openly gay candidate from an obscure town in the Midwest is perfectly viable, to me shows the Democratic Party leans forward, not backwards. And it's inspiring, right? And the question to me that comes as a consequence of that is, why is it that communities that are underrepresented in the corridors of power have historically not been better represented? Why do we not take that kind of risk of participating in the process? And I think it's fear. And I think we're afraid of two things. One is we're afraid of losing and being embarrassed. But I think what we're really afraid of is that we might actually win. And that if we win, we might realize that we're more powerful than we are. And that we have a greater responsibility to our communities and our societies than we thought we did beforehand, right? So before we could write off our responsibility. Once we know it's possible, then that's no longer the case. And the last thing that I would say is, the lesson to me is that even when you lose, you win, right? So that even though Mayor Pete's not the nominee, right, he has started a number of conversations, introduced a number of ideas, and because he had the courage to throw his hat in the ring, he has advanced both the community identities he represents, but also the ideas that he otherwise wouldn't have gotten the same kind of platform that he would have had he not had that courage. So for that, I thank you for the inspiration, and I'll hand it back to you, Waj.
With great power comes great responsibility. Next up, we have Arshia Wajid, a leading health tech entrepreneur from Chicago, Illinois. Wajid founded the largest volunteer-based health professional organization in the South Asian community, American Muslim Health Professionals, that has over 12,000 members that fights for policy and local change. Arshia. This is what we call a pregnant pause, just because she's going to come in with something genius. Or probably a technical difference.
Sorry about that. Thank you. Thank you very much. We already touched on this earlier, but Mayor Pete, as a health professional, I cannot emphasize enough the need for us to move towards Medicare for all so that every American has access to coverage. The Affordable Care Act was a great first step, but it still left 30 million uninsured. And nearly 27 million people now may have lost employer-sponsored insurance because of layoffs due to the pandemic. So people really, they should not have to choose between paying bills and buying medicines. They should not have to choose between putting food on the table or getting certain diagnostic tests. And if anything, I think this pandemic has really exposed how broken our healthcare system is and how it is designed to profit pharmaceutical and insurance companies. It's not that we don't have the money. We actually spend the most per person, as you know, than any other industrialized country. And yet we have millions uninsured and have poor health outcomes. So if there is a time to fix this broken system, it is now. So my urge is really for the Democratic Party to do the right thing and push for Medicare for all. And if we can give tax breaks to billionaires, we can certainly afford to provide health coverage to every individual in this country. Thank you.
All right, Arshia brought the fire. Now from New York City, Dr. Debbie Almontaser, noted by several leading educational journalists for her trailblazing work in the New York City public schools. Her school curriculum and model has been sought after across the nation. She has tireless advocacy and an experience of her tireless advocacy on immigration is unmatched. And I would like to say she has been an amazing leader and representative of the Yemeni Muslim American community. Debbie from New York.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Wajahat. And Mayor Pete, it's a pleasure to meet you. You have really inspired so many generations, young and old. And so thank you for your leadership and your tenacity to run and to really show that the impossible is possible. As I, sat and reflected on everything that you had spoken about, as well as my colleagues, I live in the epicenter of the pandemic right now. New York has been completely transformed beyond belief. It's as if though we are living in a fantasy world, a sci-fi movie. And the thing that concerns me the most is that we have all been very aware of the racial disparities in our country for decades and decades. And now we have seen these racial disparities actually materialize in the loss of lives. Right now, the largest number of individuals that have died from COVID-19 are actually Black and Brown communities. So what are we as a nation going to do? You know, we've been talking about this, and now we've seen the casualties of these communities. What are we going to do to change the plight of Black and Brown communities? How are we as a party going to take the responsibility to work collectively and make sure that something like this doesn't happen? And we shouldn't have had to lose lives of individuals to know that these racial disparities have caused a great deal of strife for so many Americans across the United States. You know, you talked about the food deserts. New York City is a food desert, you know, city where they only rely on small bodegas or delis to feed them. And these are now essential workers in New York City that have actually sadly become infected and have lost their lives because of COVID-19. So, you know, the way that you know, funding is being provided, the way that it's being dispersed, it, you know, raises so many questions of how we as a country have been operating and what we need to do post this pandemic to make sure that we are in a good place and that we are able to meet the challenges. And I also really point out this thing with outsourcing. We shouldn't have never outsourced masks and PPE material, you know, because look at where we are. We're left in a very vulnerable position. I'll stop there because I've been told I'm muted.
You're not muted, but thank you, Debbie. Next up, we are showing a lot of love to mayors today. So we have another mayor from New Jersey, Mayor Sadaf Jaffer, the popular mayor of Montgomery Township. Jaffer taught at Princeton and won awards for her doctoral work at Harvard. She's currently on the front lines of changing local communities and delivering results to underserved communities. Mayor.
Thank you. So here is my reflection on the future of the Democratic Party in 80 seconds or less. I'm a proud Democrat because I believe in the values of racial, economic, gender, and environmental justice. The future of the Democratic Party must be to forefront these values and come up with practical strategies to implement policies in line with them at the local, county, state, and national levels. During Trump's inauguration, I attended an event at Princeton University on the crisis of global liberalism. The argument of the scholars on that panel was that liberals are so focused on national and international issues that we neglect the local. This is one of the reasons I went into local politics, and I know that Mayor Pete Buttigieg also shares my commitment and passion for the local. We need to provide far more support for candidates and electeds in terms of policy development and implementation so that we can be the best representatives of the Democratic Party. Our political sphere has become too focused on a cult of personality rather than highlighting our shared commitment to a just, prosperous, and sustainable future for all. This is the future I look forward to working towards as a Democrat. Thank you.
Thank you. Saafir Rabb is a change maker from Baltimore. Mr. Rabb has transformed the lives of thousands of families in the Maryland region. He has been honored by the Maryland governor and President Obama for his tireless work on providing affordable housing. Saafir Rabb.
Thank you, Wajahat, and I want to give a shout out to Mudassir for doing this. You guys do an amazing job. And I want to thank and congratulate Mayor Pete for being a local leader who threw his hat in the ring for national leadership. I think that, and what I'd like to offer as a reflection, and I'd love to get response about, is, you know, the way we think about the Muslim community in the United States of America is typically conflated with international communities, despite the fact that, you know, some of the most popular Americans ever to exist, including Muhammad Ali and Malcolm X and others, have really defined what it means to be a Muslim, what it means to be American, and what it means to be local. At what point will the Democratic Party include the view of American-lensed Islamic identity? I think to the extent that we can do more coalition building and reach across difference as much as possible, we stand a great chance in November. And I'd like to hear your responses to how we can better include more perspectives of Islamic concerns.
Thank you, Saafir. It would not be a Muslim gathering without an Imam. So we have an Imam, of course, Imam Abdullah Antepli from Duke University, North Carolina. He's an award-winning professor and religious leader at Duke. He has been featured in the New York Times, The Atlantic, and NPR for his groundbreaking work on interfaith relations. Imam.
Thank you so very much, Concordia, Mayor Pete. What a pleasure. I was in that high school gym in Raleigh, North Carolina, cheering for you and your husband when you were in town. I arrived to North Carolina in July 2008. It was a purple state back then. And I proudly campaigned for President Obama, who won North Carolina in 2008. And since then, this purple state and many like this beautiful state of North Carolina became figuratively and literally and politically red. And there is an increase, I was able to see it from a very close proximity, this increasing rage of Americans, anger, almost unprocessed anger brewing, which reflects in some of the recent political disadministration and the voting patterns, etc. So my question is, a lot of these people, a lot of those North Carolinians and in many other red states and other places, the way they see or perceive how liberals and progressives like you and I treat them is as if they're a basket of deplorables, as if they are in some ways like immoral people, as if their political disagreements are moral disagreements that we always look down on them, etc. And they are despised how their views and political disagreements are represented by the worst members of that community. And as a Muslim, I know what does it mean to be represented by the worst members of my own community. Do you have any engagement strategy with that red anger and red states? What happened since the last decade and a half? Do you think this is a duty beyond winning the election? There is a moral responsibility here that we need to engage with those people. And if so, what are some of your engagement strategies? Who are your peacemakers, bridge builders in your circles who would like to engage with this population, these fellow Americans? Thank you.
So we're going to go from red-purple North Carolina to reddish-purple Texas. We have Arshad Matin, one of the leading venture capitalists that started the tech revolution in Austin, Texas. Always keep Austin weird. Matin is the CEO of Avetta. He has been honored by Business Week for his experience in global organization strategy, where he has managed over $3 billion, that's with a B, billion dollars in revenue. Arshad.
Thank you, Wajahat, and Mayor Pete. It's an honor to speak with you, and thank you for joining us. So I moved to Texas in 1995, so I've been here 25 years. I was actually with McKinsey. I was a partner at McKinsey in the Texas office for many years. And, I was just going to build on what Imam was saying. He's worried about North Carolina going from purple to red. I'm watching Texas, of course, turn purple and hopefully, inshallah, turn blue in not too distant a future. So I wanted to focus on a couple of things for the Democratic Party and so I'd love to hear your views. So one is, look, Texas demographically looks today what America would look like 20 years from now. So it's a very interesting experiment for the Democratic Party to build a winning and long surviving coalition. There's some interesting work being done here in Texas, in Houston, Dallas, Austin, so on. And I'd love to hear how is the Democratic Party thinking about this Texas experiment. The Muslim community has been quite actively engaged with a lot of different constituencies. So that's sort of one thought. The other one is sort of much more tactical. For us to accelerate Texas turning blue, we have to win more local races. So we have 9 seats. We are 9 seats short of taking over Texas House. I think the Democratic Party needs to spend more resources, more money. And if we can turn Texas House blue, I think we'll get Texas blue faster because of gerrymandering that we can take away, as well as some of the voter suppression that goes on in parts of Texas. So thank you, and I look forward to seeing what you're going to do next.
We're going to go to another reddish-purple state and to another Imam who's trying to take his state and make it blue. Of course, we're talking about Atlanta, Georgia. Imam Mansoor Sabree, who is the director of the Inner City Muslim Action Network, a leader, a national recognized leader of his communities. Imam Mansoor Sabree from Atlanta. Take it away.
Wajahat, thank you so much. Honored to share a few words with you all today, especially during this blessed month for us as Muslims during the month of Ramadan, reflecting on how we dig deeper to give to our community, our society, to make it better. The work that I do, particularly here in Atlanta, is focused on criminal justice reform. And when I think about the Democratic Party and think about the history of America and mass incarceration, I'm deeply concerned about what our future will look like. I'm deeply concerned about what we're going to do dramatically to transform how we incarcerate citizens of this land. In particular here in Georgia, as mentioned, it's on the cusp of really having some new changes happen politically. A part of that is the reenfranchisement of formerly incarcerated men and women, giving them the opportunity to vote. We know that this has happened across the country, and we need to see that happen here. But I want to echo some of the points that have just been made by friends and colleagues here in the areas of education as well, that the Democratic Party, it's our focus in this area of providing holistic and complete education that doesn't break the bank for families, communities in our modern day to get a strong and healthy secondary education, and then a post-secondary education, a higher education, where it's really focused on allowing for minority communities to get better access and not really causing the type of economic hardship that it's been for so many communities and families. I live, work, play, pray in the Black community, and we see that the difference between having an education and not is the difference between having a strong financial economic life and not having enough food to eat. So in this time of COVID-19, we're seeing all of the underlying issues within our community and society just stand out in so many ways, particularly in having proper access to education, dealing with the lack of employment for formerly incarcerated, to really address these issues. Thank you all for your time and your attention.
Thank you, Imam Mansoor. And last but not least, from Chicago, we have Samar Kaukab, director of one of the leading tech incubators. She has set new heights at the University of Chicago and Columbia University. She's also a passionate advocate for women's rights, and she was honored by the Aspen Institute for her work. Samar.
Hi, Mayor Pete. I'm a mom of 3 and a born, bred, and cried Midwesterner. South Bend is not an obscure town to me. I work at Columbia University, partnering with leading scientists to explore the critical questions of our age. Even prior to the COVID crisis, there's been long-standing challenges facing the United States, from declining federal investments in research and development to an alarming lack of women and people of color in innovation activity. For example, just 16% of patents are granted to women and even less to underrepresented minorities. We're leaving the future Grace Hoppers out of the world of innovation, missing their unique insights and discoveries. Disproportionate impacts from the coronavirus crisis will only increase these inequalities, piling on decades of pre-existing disparities. As in the aftermath of the Great Recession, the resilience of women and people of color will be fundamental to our recovery. It's critical for Democratic policymakers to maintain their commitments to address the disparity of STEM and its early beginnings, long before college and career. We have an opportunity to present solutions to problems such as the lack of Wi-Fi at home or STEM facilities in schools. Maintaining leadership in our scientific enterprise and improving innovation in the United States requires a range of solutions. What in your mind should the Democratic Party's priority in this space be?
Thank you, everyone, for your contributions. You just heard from 10 leading American Muslim leaders from all across the country. We appreciate the fact that all of you are engaged, that all of you care, that all of you have done such fantastic work. And of course, now Mayor Pete Buttigieg, with 10 minutes left, will answer all of those questions. I'm only kidding, Mayor Pete. I appreciate you sticking around, Mayor Pete, and listening. And I say this as a compliment, as a nerd, fellow nerd. I saw that you were taking notes. So before we open it up to Q&A, your thoughts, what do you want to respond to?
Yeah, let me, there's so many things that deserve to be explored, and a lot of richness, and I know time won't allow that. Also ask your patience if you hear any interventions from our dog marking International Rescue Dog Day by barking at everybody. But let me mention a few things that were mentioned I think
Sure.
are especially just deserving to hold in our mind. One, the importance of the local. I'm so glad to hear that raised. It's one of the focuses of my own efforts in addition to campaigning for Joe Biden. We have an effort called Win the Era, which is trying to support candidates at every level. Here's what I think is happening right now. On one hand, because of the pandemic and because of the failures in the White House, we're seeing how important the state and the local are. And that's even more true as we work to protect our democracy, knowing that this is a reminder that actually in this country, most election decisions are made not by federal, but by county and state officials. The paradox is, while the local and the state have never been more important, there's never been less attention, oxygen, and money to go around for local and state races because all our attention is diverted. And so we have to have a real discipline of seeing how important that level is. And I'm glad folks here already are speaking to that. The questions of racial justice and inequality that have come up, ranging from everything from criminal justice reform to the availability of resources and startup and venture capital for entrepreneurs, I think, again, deserves a layer after layer of discussion. But quickly, I think the most important thing to remember is this. This moment could, in fact, reinforce all of the inequities that helped us get here. Or it could be the moment when we realize that it's neither possible nor desirable to go to the previous status quo. And if we get that right, this terrible situation could actually motivate us to deliver a different set of arrangements that have a different set of strengths rather than the weaknesses and the winners and losers that has been reproduced. And that's why the dialogue can't just be about getting us back to where we were before. I'm thrilled to hear fellow red state people on the call. I believe there's no such thing as a permanently red state. I'm excited about Texas. In fact, I'm participating in an event soon to support those some of those House Democratic candidates. North Carolina is a big focus for us at Win the Era for the same reason. And I really admire this insight of Imam's on how, as a Muslim, you relate to the experience that is actually in the heart of maybe people who are conservative, who feel judged by those who are left of center by being judged by the worst of their number. There's a real compassion in that I think lights the way toward the sort of compassion that will get us out of this polarization. I don't believe the solution to polarization is always going to be ideological centrism or changing all of our values or positions. I do believe that building bridges through compassion and sometimes perhaps through faith is a beautiful and affirming way to do that. So I think there's such power in that. And last, I just want to acknowledge what was mentioned in terms of the range of the Islamic communities. That can be everyone from somebody who's new in this country, in the US, or visiting this country as a student. I think about when I go to the masjid here in South Bend, and it's everybody from a graduate student from Pakistan who will be here for a year or two, to a member of a family through generations that have never left the United States. And I think about the Black Muslim tradition. You won't think of Indiana as having produced a lot of prominent Black Muslim leaders, but actually look at Andre Carson, a friend of mine who is a member of Congress from Indianapolis, a Black Muslim progressive representing the state of Indiana in the United States Congress. So it's that diversity within the Muslim community that I think is especially powerful at a moment like this, where we've got to do a better job of tapping the diversity across communities within the United States and so many Western countries.
That was well done, Amir Pete. Thank you so much. We have you for 12 more minutes, and if you don't mind, I'm going to take up all those 12 minutes to ask some questions. You mentioned faith, and I have two questions on faith, because we are talking to American Muslims, and I want to just relate a story to you of what I heard recently. Went to a restaurant, Pakistani restaurant, right? The owner was Pakistani Muslim. And I said, who are you going to vote for? I just assumed he would vote for the Democrat. And he said, well, you know, Trump or the Democrats, I don't know, let's see. But, you know, Democrats, they're all about abortion and gay marriage. And those were the two sticking points. And if we are to be honest, and we should be honest, within many faith communities, it comes down to those two cultural divides, abortion and LGBT anything. And you're talking to Muslims right now. How do you, as a person of faith, who's a gay man, who's married, reconcile courting or speaking out to or doing outreach to those religious groups who think your entire being is a sin?
I think the first and the most important thing is, again, to approach these things in a spirit of compassion. You know, to me, and this is just me, my marriage and my faith are closely connected. I believe my marriage has moved me nearer to God. And it was important to me that we be married in our church, in the Episcopal Cathedral here in South Bend. I know that that's not where every faith community or every LGBTQ family story lines up. But what I know is that regardless of doctrines, there is a commitment to a desire to treat one another with dignity and to see in one another one's own humanity that I think is not only compatible with faith, but is what so many different faith traditions can point us toward. I think there are issues that sometimes will be irreconcilable across certain doctrinal teachings, and certainly the different views on an issue like abortion are an example of that. That's where I think it's important to recognize that while I try to be transparent about my own faith and my own faith commitments, I also try to insist that as a civic figure, as somebody seeking office or serving in office, it's very important to find solutions that all of us with our different commitments, people of any religion and people of no religion, can feel we have an equal claim on. And so on the issue of abortion, for example, for me, it's a recognition that different people will not agree on where we can draw the line, but also that we might be able, more of us, to agree on who should draw the line. And in my view, that who should draw the line are the women faced with this decision. This is a matter of finding a space where all of us have the ability to live life in a way that is compatible with our values. And I believe in the greatest degree of liberty possible, short of someone's exercising their beliefs in a way that harms somebody else. And that's where I think every right in the American system, from freedom of religion to freedom of speech, meets its limits, is when the exercise of that right could bring harm to another.
And you mentioned your faith, and I, for one, actually got heat on social media when I praised the fact that you mentioned your faith in the debates. I got heat from progressives who said, I don't like it when Meyer Pete talks about his faith, or I don't like it when they're bringing in faith when it comes to progressive values. And this is just my opinion. I believe that progressives and Democrats have ceded the ground of that moral voice, that religious values, those prophetic narratives to the right. And in my opinion, the right has hijacked it for immoral, unchristian means. And so what do you say to progressives who are, actually not only just missing out on this huge space, which moves so many people in America, but also are hostile to those who are both progressive and people of faith?
Yeah, I guess the message is, I'm not asking you to come on board with some religious worldview that isn't yours. I'm asking you to join me in appealing to those who do, because there's a way to do it that's intellectually honest. In fact, I think it's much more intellectually honest to point to the ways in which a person, for example, in my Christian faith tradition, should seek something different than the separation of families at the border or the perpetuation of racial inequity, much more than whatever theological contortions must go on in the mind of Mike Pence to make it possible for him to serve at the side of a man like Donald Trump. And so we're absolutely in a position to reclaim. By the way, many of the greatest dimensions of the American progressive tradition, if you go back 100 or 120 years ago, are steeped in faith. And again, I think the reason we have an allergy to this in the Democratic Party is actually a healthy reason, which is that we have seen, in one way the queer community and in another way the Muslim community, have seen the consequences of people trying to impose their interpretation of their religion on others from public office. That's not what this is about. This is about making sure that people of any religion and of no religion feel spoken to by our politics. And that means not being transparent about how each of us in our own moral formations comes to the political views that we care about.
I never want you or anyone else to actually invest time in the mind of Mike Pence or think about the mental contortions, but thank you for that exercise. We're in a pandemic right now, and this pandemic has more than 35 million Americans who are looking for work. Probably more than 100,000 people have died. We're not just looking at a recession, most likely we're looking at depression. What should be the key steps for an economic recovery? Of course, we have a gridlocked Congress. We know the House Democrats want a $3 trillion plan. We know it's DOA in the Senate. But what do you really think? If you had your druthers right now, this is what could restart this economy. This is what could save us. What would you do?
Well, it starts with recognizing that the objective is not to return to what we had before, because all of the failures of what we had before helped set the table for where we've wound up now. Remember, this virus both revealed and exploited the inequities in our society in order to propagate itself. So we've got to understand what the goal is. And the goal is not to get back on the old track. The goal is to build a new one. And to build a new one that is going to lead us to a place where there is greater equity and greater resilience. What does that look like concretely? Well, I think it does mean decoupling a lot of our benefit structures from the assumption that you're going to have one lifelong relationship with one employer, whether we're talking about how you get healthcare or savings for retirement or access to vacation and sick days. I think it means making sure that workers are more empowered across our society. I think
does that mean a $15 wage? Are you for that?
Yes, as a beginning. I mean, you know, consider this. In the first wave of relief packages, they set a level of relief that was enough to live on, right? Which included adding a $600 kicker to unemployment. And then there were some conservatives who objected, saying this is more than some people were making in their jobs, which in some cases was true. For example, we're a low-income community. It's not unusual for folks here to be making $7 or $8 an hour, or just over $7 with the federal minimum wage. The fact that the unemployment benefit, which was set according to what you need in order to live, is greater than the wages were. That's not an indication the unemployment benefit was too generous. It's an indication that poverty wages are unsustainable. So let's look at what this has actually revealed in terms of unfinished business we've had as a country for a long time. And that's before we even begin to speak about the burning racial issues of racial inequality that are at stake here. And let's get it right this time. Look, the New Deal didn't come about because FDR thought it up, promised it on the campaign trail, got elected, and then delivered it. It came about because extremely imaginative measures were required in order to deal with an emergency. And they put together the New Deal through an experience of in many ways, success and failure, side by side, dealing with this calamity. That's what this moment could be like for us. And if nothing else, you know, in as much as it requires a recognition of our interdependence, international coordination, and a belief in science, our experience of dealing with this pandemic is the nearest thing we will get to a trial run on how we're going to deal with climate, which has the same patterns of harm and danger, and perhaps some of the same patterns in how it could be confronted and solved too. This is our chance. I'm not saying this will vindicate everything we already believe. We should all be questioning our assumptions from before. But that many of the things we've known for a long time are unsustainable. We will be both compelled and I think empowered at a moment like this to change them, because all bets are off when you look at where we are now compared to where we were even 3 months ago.
So we have 2 minutes. I, of course, could speak to you for another hour and just unpack what you just said, but I'm mindful of the time, and now there's about 30 questions coming in. We won't get to all of them, but in order to have a shot at this new age type New Deal, which includes perhaps a Green Deal package to tackle climate change, to have living wages for once, to have paid parental leave, to have some form of affordable healthcare, I would hope Medicare for all, but something better than we have right now. Democrats got to win. And so for the Muslims who are listening right now, and for a lot of our faith communities who have tuned in, what is your pitch to them to organize and get out to vote in 2020?
So one of the things I really admire about Muslim communities everywhere I go is a level of civic engagement and an understanding of the obligation of having an impact around it. You certainly see that in the Islamic Society here where I live, which has responded with everything from a mobile food pantry that is needed in the community to just being among the first, some of the leaders there among the first phone calls any mayor would make when trying to make something happen in the civic or economic life of the community. And I know that that ethos is present in every Muslim community across the country and across the world. It now must be expressed in a political fashion. And I know that sometimes it's actually maybe more natural or more safe, especially knowing that you know, Muslim political engagement has sometimes been circumscribed by an atmosphere of fear, to do things that are unobjectionable and uncontroversial. And of course, the wonderful philanthropy and scientific and medical contributions that are widely celebrated by Muslim leaders are among those that give the community such standing in the West. This is also a moment for political action and activism like never before, because the moment in front of us really will, I believe, decide the way that the next half century unfolds. And in that sense, not only being active, but being original in how that activism works, since you can't just throw open the doors of a campaign office and walk in and volunteer in person, at least not for the next few weeks, and perhaps not between now and November. Just makes it that much more important that we are calling everybody we know, that we're learning how to participate in virtual organizing and virtual phone backs, whatever it takes, because this is look, if you had told me 3 months ago when I was campaigning for president that I know things seem big now, but actually the stakes on the presidential election and the other elections are going to go way up, I would have looked at you like you were nuts, because how could it possibly be any more impactful than it already is? Now we see what's at stake.
Right.
And we have a chance not just to rally in the face of what we're up against, but to rally behind what we're for. The things you're talking about: universal health care, better racial and economic justice, better leadership. It's not just let's rally together because the wolf is at the gates. It's let's build something better. This is our chance. It might be our only good chance at this. And, we will, for the rest of our lives, I think, the generations that are alive and voting at this moment will be judged for the choice we're about to make.
Stakes are high. I promised I would let you go at 5, but in the spirit of Ramadan, I hope you can give me one more minute as we end this. I have to ask you 2 quick questions as we say goodbye to everyone. Will you run again, sir?
I don't know. I think running is a decision you make based on whether the moment calls for something that you have to offer. But what I know is whether it's in office or not, I will find ways to make myself useful.
And this is just between you and me. No one else is watching. Who should be Biden's VP?
I'll say he's got a lot of wonderful choices, and I support his decision to make sure there's gender balance on the ticket too. So look, no one knows the vice presidency. Probably no one alive today understands the vice presidency in more rich detail than Joe Biden does. So I won't presume to give him advice.
The latest poll said Warren is at tops with Democratic voters. If he chooses Warren, would that excite you?
She'd be a fantastic vice president. One of the things that in competing against her and him and others, I've learned is an enormous amount of respect for the people who ran, and I think very highly of her.
All right, so Pete Buttigieg has not committed to whether or not he's going to join the Biden administration, but he is also open to potentially joining the Biden administration. And we don't know if he's going to run again, but he is urging all of us to do our part for a historic election. I want to thank Concordia. I want to thank Mayor Pete. And I want to say this. We've come a long way, because in 2008, when this young man by the name of Barack Hussein Obama was running, if you guys remember, they attacked him because they thought he was Muslim. And I won't mention the name of a Democratic fundraiser, but I said, how come Democrats aren't doing more to engage with Muslims right now publicly? And he said, listen, man, the election's just 2 months away, which meant we were kind of like kryptonite. And so the fact that you've taken time during a pandemic to listen to us, to engage with us, to talk to us, without talking about national security or what we can do to fight ISIS, was very meaningful to me, and I think very meaningful to those who are paying attention. And for those who are paying attention right now, who feel a little bit despondent, I hope you are encouraged by the immense American Muslim talent that you have heard from, that these men and women who are not just trying to help Muslim communities, but trying to help American communities. And finally, this is a pandemic. It's a historic crisis. I hope everyone is kind to everybody, and especially you're kind to yourself, because it will be kindness that will allow us to get through this together. Thank you, everybody, for paying attention. Thank you, everyone, for tuning in. And finally, I will take the prerogative to say, vote in 2020, vote Democrat, top down, take back the White House, take back the Senate, and keep the House. Thank you, Mayor Pete.
Thanks for having me. Really appreciate it. Amen to everything you've said, and wishing everybody the best in the holiday season. Ramadan Mubarak.
Ramadan Mubarak, everyone. And now we just awkwardly stare at each other.
All right. Thanks for that. That was great. Enjoyed it.
Thanks. Take care.
Take care.